there everybody, welcome to a new episode of the vlog, and welcome to what is, if you can believe it, the 13th episode of my overly ambitious Kiss History series of videos. It's called KISSTORY. I started right at the very beginning in 1973 and have done a video for every year of Kiss's history, and today we are now well into the non-makeup era, and we are covering Asylum. So in the spring of 1985, when Kiss finished the Animalize world tour, relatively successful for them, certainly quite a success compared to the last few tours that they had done, particularly in America. And they wasted no time, and as had been kind of the theme to the last few years, because the second they left the second the tour was over, they maybe took 2 weeks off and then were immediately back into a rehearsal studio and then a physical studio in working on a new album. But one thing had changed, and that was that they actually had one consistent lineup through the whole recording of this album. As I've covered in this series, in the previous 5 years, they'd had like 4 or 5 lineup changes. Pretty much every year somebody new was in the band. It was crazy, but now they had a sort of steady lineup of Gene Simmons, Paul Stanley, Eric Carr, and Bruce Kulick. This is technically Bruce Kulick's first album with the band, although he did do some ghost guitar work on Animalize while Mark St. John was in the band. But this lineup seemed to finally actually be getting along, which was kind of something unheard of in the Kiss camp for the last several years. So that was very exciting. Gene was still pretty heavily involved in his newfound movie career. Pretty much the second Kiss took the makeup off, Gene was like, I'm going to be a movie star now. And he started to do that. But Gene and Paul were at least fairly involved in the making of this album. They actually produced it themselves. Now, same thing as Animalize. The band wasn't always all in the same studio at the same time. Bruce pretty much did his guitar parts and his solos on his own. And, I mean, this album has some of the best solos of all time. I would almost argue, and I might get hate for this because it's not an ace solo, but maybe my favorite guitar solo in the entire Kiss catalog belongs to Tears Are Falling. I don't know, that's not too unpopular of an opinion. Just an amazing solo. There's a lot of good stuff on this album, which eventually came out in the fall of 1985. And would you just look at the visuals on here. So believe it or not, this cover kind of annoyed Kiss fans when it came out, because they gave Bruce Kulick blue lips and Eric Carr green lips. Of course, if you go back to the solo albums, they all had colors. Every member of the band had their own sort of color coordination. Gene had the red, Paul had the purple, and then Ace had the blue and Peter had the green. And they were like, oh, you just can't give them their colors. I don't know. Kiss fans are a little bit quick to jump on anybody who is perceived as taking anything away from the original lineup. This is clearly not Kiss's best era when it comes to visuals. They were still kind of trying to figure out who they were without the makeup. And it was 1985, so this was the absolute peak of the glam hair metal era in music. And my God, did Kiss ever go full-blown into that. While they weren't really wearing costumes anymore, at least not in the sense of how they were, their outfits for the Asylum tour were probably the most ridiculous they had ever been. This album's kind of hit and miss for me. There's some songs on it I really like, most notably Tears Are Falling, as I mentioned, and also I'm definitely a big fan of Who Wants to Be Lonely. Love's a Deadly Weapon and Secretly Cruel are decent songs. There's a lot of filler, particularly Gene filler. And then there's the song All Night, which has really not aged all that well with Kiss fans. It's very, very excruciatingly 80s. Out of all the eras in Kiss's history, this seems to be the one, well, this and The Elder, this seems to be the one that they ignore the most when talking about their history now. They tend to brush over the fact that these awkward mid-80s releases ever existed. But Asylum came out. It did not do as well as Animalize had before it. Didn't chart particularly well. I think it reached a peak of, I want to say, number 21 on the charts, and only fell from there. But as usual, as Kiss does, first thing they do when they put out an album, they go out on tour again, and they try to revamp the stage and do some new things, and they absolutely did that. This new stage is very notable for having an absolutely enormous, I don't know the actual specifications of it, but it's probably a 20 or 30 foot tall Light Up Kiss logo. Light Up Kiss logo was at that time pretty much always the backdrop to their show, and this was far and away the largest one they had ever used. So it's a very visually stunning stage. I actually believe they cycled through 3 different stages throughout throughout this tour. The first one I know had the Asylum cover art sort of draped in fabric along the floor, but whatever that fabric was allegedly very slippery, and so it only survived about 7 or 8 shows before they ditched that completely. And then I think they revamped the stage once again in the early months of 1986 to get rid of a lot of the ramps and just consist of, well, a whole crap load of amplifiers. Set-wise, they added a few new songs from the Asylum album, and they got rid of some classics, like Black Diamond was no longer in the set list. In fact, by this point, they had dwindled their set down to only 4 70s tunes. Kiss were very much focused on the now at this point. They were not, they had not gotten all aboard that nostalgia train yet. They were still trying to be current. So I think they played Love Gun, Detroit Rock City, Rock and Roll All Night, and Cold Gin, and I think that's the entirety of the 70s catalog. I don't even think they played Shout It Out Loud on this tour. If they did, it wasn't every show. And yeah, they were pretty much doing all 80s all the time, which was hit or miss with the fans at that point, but a lot of the 70s fans had pretty much moved on by this point. The tour was not hugely successful, but it wasn't really a flop either. It took place over several months from November of 84 through, I think it ended, or excuse me, November of 85 through about April of 86. And I believe they averaged 5,000 or 6,000 people a night. About what the Asylum tour had averaged, or the Animalized tour had averaged the previous year, if not maybe slightly less. I know their ticket prices had gone up by this point, so they at least made, I think, marginally more money from the Asylum tour than they had the Animalized tour. Now, when this tour was over in April, because we're not super happy with how stagnant their sales and stuff had been, so they wanted to move things to the next level. So they wanted to get a big name producer who had made some hit albums recently, particularly for some 70s artists moving on into the 80s, and that guy was Ron Nevison, and he was not available. So long story short, after the Asylum tour ended, Kiss took like a year-long break, which is highly unusual for them. Really, it hadn't been something that they had done since, they hadn't done this long of a touring break since the Alive to Dynasty tour break, but even during that, they were releasing new projects and stuff. But there was a long gap where the only release that Kiss fans got was this rather hilarious pseudo-mockumentary type video cassette called Exposed, which came out in January of 1987. Had some of the music videos from the Asylum album, as well as some of the other 80s releases, and also included some classic 70s concert footage. I actually love this video. It's so hokey. It's highly stupid, but that's kind of what I love about it. I love Kiss the most when they take themselves the least seriously.
But that's Paul's one. A doorbell. Here he comes. Paul, how are you?
Oh my God, it's Lifestyles. Stretching the point just a bit. I tried to make this room up to be like his place at home.
Bruce! Is this the documentary?
Yes.
Edit her out. Paul, edit her out.
Edit her out when we put this together. On the last tour, on the Asylum tour, that's a picture of Joseph Kiss Sr., who came up with the vision of Kiss in 1753. Right, Joseph Kiss.
That's, of course, a picture of him without makeup.
That's right, Mr. Joseph Kiss Sr.
Yes, the Paul Stanley workout tape for dirty minds and clean bodies. I will show you how to get the body you always wanted and the woman it belongs to. Yes, the Paul Stanley exercise tape. Join me, won't you? Because a muscle is a terrible thing to waste.
Love this video, and this video is generally a hit with most Kiss fans, and I think that in the 80s and 90s, Kiss did a really good job with their long-form video releases. I just did a video on my collection of the old Kiss VHS tapes. I think they did a great job, and I know they made a decent amount of money on that, and I know the Kiss were one of the earlier bands to make use of VHS/Laserdisc as a way to sort of bolster their catalogs, and it was very successful for them. But yeah, that's Asylum. Sorry if I didn't go as in-depth as I usually do. To be perfectly honest with you, the mid to late 80s era is probably the era of Kiss that I'm the least interested in. But, you know, I still give Asylum a spin every once in a while. Yeah, and like I said, band mostly getting along. I know they're having their fighting with Eric occasionally by this point. But Bruce is really enjoying himself. Again, they're leaving. They had left. I mentioned in the Animalized video that when it came to doing the studio work, they had mostly left Mark St. John to his own devices in the studio, and they were not really happy with what they heard afterwards. And then it appears they didn't learn from their mistake, because they did the same thing for Bruce. But the difference is, I'm not saying that Mark St. John wasn't an incredibly talented guitarist, because he was. But Bruce seems to be much more productive and know what Gene and Paul wants. And when they let him to his own devices, he really made magic in the studio. Bruce, I will say, is probably the most technically gifted guitarist that they've ever had. Now, maybe Vinny and Mark St. John were able to play more notes. Were able to, were maybe more of like an instrumental virtuoso than Bruce was. But Bruce wrote so many memorable solos. And if you watch Bruce Kulick, I gotta give him so much credit. He's been doing lots of Facebook Live videos recently where he's playing solos and riffs and stuff from Kiss's past, and man, does that guy still got it. He's been in Grand Funk Railroad the last 20 years, actually. And yeah, no, he's killing it. He's awesome. I'd love to see him in some capacity in concert at some point. That will do it for this episode of KISSTORY. I'll come back with another video at some point. I don't do these videos super regularly. I do one every few weeks. The next one, of course, will be on the next chapter of Kiss's history with their next album, Crazy Nights. Thank you so much for watching. For those of you who don't know, I'm also a professional musician myself. Not touring right now due to the COVID-19 crisis. Have no idea when I'll be back doing that. But you can check out the description for a list of where you can find my music, where it's sold or streamed online. You can like this video if you like what you saw. Subscribe to this channel if you've been enjoying my videos. And you can ring the notification bell too if you want to be notified whenever I upload a new video, which should hopefully be tomorrow. And most days for the foreseeable future. Thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you again soon.